The stars looked different when death was coming. Admiral Han Wu stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching the enemy fleet emerge from hyperspace like angry red dots on the tactical screen, and each dot meant 1,000 alien warriors ready to destroy everything humans had built in 3 centuries of space travel. The Vorthak Empire had finally come to finish what they started, and their ships filled the void between stars like a swarm of metal insects, hungry for human blood. Han Wu was 63 years old and had fought in 12 major battles, but nothing had prepared him for this moment when the scanner showed over 2,000 enemy vessels dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation, while the human fleet could barely muster 40 ships to defend the entire sector. Captain Lee Nari watched the same display from her command chair, aboard the dreadnought Indomitable Spirit, and felt her stomach turn cold as the numbers kept climbing on her screen. The Vorthak had brought everything they had, and more ships kept arriving every minute like a tide of death that would wash over every human world in this part of the galaxy. Lee Nari was 38 and had commanded the Indomitable Spirit for 6 years through border skirmishes and pirate raids, but this was different because everyone knew the mathematics of what they faced, and the math said they were all going to die. Today, Chief Engineer Park Day looked up from his console in the engine room where he had spent the last 20 years keeping human ships running against impossible odds, and saw the power readings that told him exactly how hopeless their situation had become. The Vorthak ships were bigger and stronger, and carried weapons that could crack a planet in half, while the human fleet was mostly older vessels held together with spare parts and determination. Lieutenant Kim Sol was only 24 and had been assigned to weapons control just 6 months ago, but she could read the tactical display well enough to know that 40 human ships against 2,000 alien warships was not a battle but a massacre waiting to happen. The communication channels filled with desperate voices from colony worlds across the sector as evacuation ships launched in panic while alien scouts began attacking the outer settlements. Admiral Han Wu listened to the reports flooding in from Kepler 7 and New Seoul and Harmony Station, where millions of civilians were scrambling to reach any ship that could carry them away from the advancing enemy. The evacuation fleets were moving as fast as they could, but civilian ships were slow and crowded and needed time to reach the jump points where they could escape. To hyperspace time was the one thing the human fleet could not give them, because the Vorthak advance was too fast and too overwhelming. Han Wu closed his eyes for a moment and thought about his wife and daughter who were safe on Earth, but might not be safe much longer if the Vorthak broke through here and continued their advance toward the core worlds. He opened his eyes and activated the fleet command channel to speak to every captain under his command. His voice was steady when he spoke, but everyone who knew him could hear the weight of what he was about to say. The last stand protocol had never been used in actual combat, because no situation had ever been desperate enough to require it until now. The protocol was simple in concept, but terrible in practice because it meant asking volunteers to stay behind and fight a battle they could not win, while the rest of the fleet escorted evacuation ships to safety. It meant asking good people to die so that others might live. Han Wu explained the situation clearly, because his officers deserved the truth about what they faced. The Vorthak fleet was too large and too powerful for the human forces to defeat in direct combat. The evacuation fleets needed at least 18 hours to clear the danger zone and reach hyperspace. The human fleet could hold the enemy for maybe 4 hours in conventional battle before being completely destroyed. The only way to buy enough time was for volunteer ships to remain behind and use hit-and-run tactics to delay the Vorthak advance while the main fleet protected the evacuating civilians. Everyone understood that volunteering for the last stand protocol meant never going home again. The communication channel stayed silent for long minutes as 40 ship captains considered whether they were ready to die for strangers they would never meet. Captain Lee Nari looked around her bridge at the faces of her crew and saw Chief Engineer Park Day watching her from his station park. Day had served with her for 4 years, and they had developed the kind of trust that only comes from facing danger together. He gave her a small nod that said he would follow her decision, whatever it might be. Lieutenant Kim Sol was checking her weapon systems with the focused intensity of someone trying not to think about dying, while Dr. Yunbo monitored crew health readings that would become meaningless in a few hours. Lee Nari thought about the civilians on the evacuation ships who were probably holding their children close, and praying that someone would give them enough time to escape. She thought about the human colonies that had been built with sweat and dreams, and were now burning under Vorthak weapons. She thought about Earth and wondered if anyone there knew how badly the war was going. Then she activated her communication system and spoke the words that would make her crew legends. The indomitable spirit would volunteer for the last stand protocol. Her announcement surprised no one on the bridge because they had all seen the same tactical displays and reached the same conclusion. If someone had to stay behind and die to protect the evacuation fleets, then it might as well be them. Admiral Han Wu felt his heart sink when he heard Li Nari volunteer because the indomitable spirit was one of his best ships with one of his most capable crews, but he also felt proud because this was what humans did when everything seemed hopeless. They found a way to keep fighting. The other ship captains listened as Li Nari explained her reasoning in the calm, professional voice she used for all her command decisions. The indomitable spirit was the newest and most heavily armed vessel in the sector fleet, which meant it could do the most damage and survive the longest against Vorthak forces. Her crew was experienced and well-trained, and had worked together long enough to function effectively under extreme pressure. Most importantly, the ship carried experimental armor and weapon systems that might give them advantages the enemy would not expect. Other captains began volunteering, but Li Nari cut them off with the authority of someone who had already made peace with her fate. One ship could move faster and hide better than multiple ships working together. One ship could take risks that would be foolish for a larger force. One ship could become a ghost in the void that the Vorthak would have to hunt down piece by piece. The mathematics were brutal but clear, and Li Nari had always been good. With numbers, Admiral Han Wu gave the final authorization for the last stand protocol, with a heavy heart because he was sending good people to their deaths. The main fleet would escort the evacuation ships toward the outer rim, while the indomitable spirit remained behind to face an enemy force that outnumbered them 50-1. Li Nari ordered her crew to prepare for extended independent operations, which was military language for getting ready to die alone in the dark between stars. Chief Engineer Park Day began transferring power from non-essential systems to weapons and shields, while Lieutenant Kim Sol ran diagnostics on every missile and energy cannon the ship carried. Dr. Yun Bo checked medical supplies and wondered how long she could keep treating wounded crew members with limited resources. The evacuation fleets began their long journey toward safety, carrying 2 million civilians who would never know the names of the people who died to save them. The main human fleet formed protective formations around the slow-moving civilian ships and prepared for the fighting retreat that would carry them away from the battle zone. The indomitable spirit turned toward the advancing Vorthak armada and increased speed like a single wolf charging toward a pack of hunters. Captain Li Nari sat in her command chair and watched the enemy fleet grow larger on her tactical display, while her crew worked with the quiet efficiency of professionals who knew their job might be the last thing they ever did. The ship's artificial intelligence calculated their chances of survival, and wisely decided not to share the results with anyone in the depths of space where no one could hear them. The crew of the indomitable spirit prepared to write their names in fire and blood across the darkness. 3 days had passed since the indomitable spirit had become the loneliest ship in the galaxy, and Captain Li Nari was beginning to understand why ancient Earth warriors had sung songs before battle. The silence between fights was harder to bear than the chaos of combat, because it gave her crew time to think about home and family and all the things they would never see again. The ship drifted through an asteroid field near the dead world of Kappa Prime, where mining colonies had once extracted rare metals until the Vorthak advance reached them 2 weeks ago. Chief Engineer Park Day had turned off most of the ship's systems to reduce their energy signature, which made the indomitable spirit almost invisible to enemy sensors, but also made it cold and dark inside like a tomb waiting for bodies. Lieutenant Kim Sol monitored passive sensors from her weapon station and counted the Vorthak patrol ships that passed nearby without detecting the hidden human vessel. The enemy had learned to be careful after losing 6 heavy cruisers and 2 battleships to what their communications called the ghost ship. The Vorthak had expected to sweep through human space like a wildfire consuming dry grass, but instead, they found themselves hunting a phantom that appeared without warning and vanished before they could respond. Dr. Yunbo moved quietly through the ship's corridors, checking on crew members who had been injured in the last skirmish when they had ambushed a Vorthak supply convoy. Half. The medical bay had been destroyed by enemy fire, but she kept working with basic tools and salvaged alien medical equipment that she was learning to use through trial and error. Sergeant Major O. Jin was examining weapons taken from destroyed Vorthak ships and trying to understand how alien technology might be adapted for human use. The Marines under his command had become experts at boarding actions during the hit-and-run attacks that kept the enemy fleet off balance, and confused tech specialist. Baymin sat at her communications console, listening to intercepted Vorthak transmissions and human distress signals from across the sector. The alien language was harsh and difficult, but she had learned enough to understand their tactical communications and troop movements. What she heard in those transmissions made her stomach turn cold because the Vorthak were not just invading human space, but harvesting entire populations for purposes that she did not want to imagine. The evacuation fleets were still 3 days away from the safety of hyperspace jump points, and every hour the indomitable spirit could delay the enemy advance meant thousands more human lives saved. Captain Lee Nari studied star charts on her command display and planned their next strike against a Vorthak battle group that was moving to intercept fleeing civilian ships. The enemy had begun using more sophisticated tactics to hunt for the ghost ship, but they still thought like conquerors instead of hunters. They expected their prey to run toward safety instead of attacking from the shadows like a predator, defending its territory. The indomitable spirit had become something new in human naval doctrine because no ship had ever operated alone for so long. Behind enemy lines, Chief Engineer Park Day had performed miracles keeping the vessel operational with salvaged parts and creative repairs that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. He had learned to cannibalize Vorthak technology and integrate it with human systems in ways that created unexpected capabilities. The ship's weapons were now hybrid designs that fired human projectiles, guided by alien targeting computers. The shields used Vorthak power generators to boost human defensive arrays beyond their original specifications. Even the engines had been modified with alien components that allowed for faster acceleration and more precise maneuvering. Lieutenant Kim Sol had become the ship's tactical genius through necessity, because fighting impossible odds required thinking in ways that no military academy had ever taught. She studied enemy ship movements and weapon patterns until she could predict Vorthak responses with deadly accuracy. Her firing solutions were works of art that used minimal ammunition to achieve maximum damage against superior forces. The crew had learned to function with only 4 hours of sleep and emergency rations that tasted like cardboard but kept them alive. Dr. Yunbo treated exhaustion and stress along with combat injuries because the human mind was not designed for constant mortal danger. She dispensed stimulants and pain medication with careful precision because her supplies were limited and irreplaceable. The ship's corridors had become familiar despite the damage from repeated battles, and the crew moved through them with the confidence of people who knew every bolt and wire. Sergeant Major O-Jin had turned the Marine quarters into a workshop where his soldiers practiced, with captured alien weapons and planned boarding tactics for ships they had never seen before. His Marines had become specialists in zero-gravity combat and could move through the twisted wreckage of destroyed vessels like deadly Shadows tech specialist. Baymin had established communication protocols with the scattered human survivors throughout the sector. She relayed intelligence about Vorthak movements and safe routes for evacuation ships while maintaining operational security for the indomitable spirit. Her reports to the fleeing human fleets were coded messages that provided hope without revealing the ghost ship's location. The Vorthak had begun referring to their mysterious enemy in terms that Baymin translated as the ship that should not exist. Enemy commanders argued in their transmissions about whether the ghost ship was a new type of human vessel or some kind of experimental technology. They could not understand how a single ship could survive against their overwhelming numbers and continue fighting. What they did not realize was that the crew of the indomitable spirit had stopped thinking about survival and started thinking about honor. Captain Lee Nari no longer calculated odds of victory because victory was impossible. Instead, she calculated how much damage they could inflict before the enemy finally cornered them. Each successful attack bought more time for civilian evacuations and proved to the Vorthak that humans would not surrender easily. The ship's artificial intelligence had been reprogrammed by Chief Engineer Park Day to focus on damage assessment and tactical analysis, instead of survival probabilities. Even the computer had learned that some missions were more important than staying alive. The next target was a Vorthak fleet tender that supplied fuel and ammunition to enemy battle groups. Destroying it would force the aliens to pull ships back from their advance to protect their supply lines. Lieutenant Kim Sol had identified the perfect ambush point where the tender would be vulnerable during a scheduled rendezvous with escort vessels. The plan required precise timing and would leave the indomitable spirit exposed to counterattack, but the potential gains justified the risks. Captain Lee Nari called her senior staff together in the damaged conference room where they had held so many meetings over the years. The holographic display showed their target and the tactical situation with stark clarity. Chief Engineer Park Day reported that the ship could handle one more major engagement before critical systems would need extensive repairs. Dr. Yunbo warned that crew fatigue was becoming dangerous, but confirmed that everyone was still fit for duty. Sergeant Major Ojin explained how his Marines would board and sabotage the enemy tender, while the ship's weapons provided covering fire tech specialist Bei Min shared intelligence about Vorthak reinforcements that would arrive within 6 hours of their attack. The meeting was brief, because they all understood the mission and trusted each other to execute their parts perfectly. As they prepared to leave their hiding place in the asteroid field, Captain Lee Nari allowed herself one moment to remember the feel of sunlight on her face. Then, she ordered the ship to battle stations and began the approach toward their next target. The indomitable spirit moved through the darkness like a hunting shark, following the scent of blood. Behind them, the asteroid field closed over their hiding place and erased all evidence that humans had ever been there. Ahead of them, the Vorthak fleet tender continued its mission, unaware that death was approaching on silent engines. The ghost ship had claimed another victim before the battle even began, because the enemy was learning to fear shadows and empty space where nothing should be. The indomitable spirit was dying by degrees, and everyone aboard could feel death creeping through the ship's wounded hull, like ice spreading through their veins. Captain Lee Nari stood at her command station studying damage reports that painted a picture of slow systemic failure across every major ship system. The life support recyclers were operating at 60% capacity and would fail completely within 48 hours. The main engines had been reduced to emergency power after a Vorthak plasma torpedo had melted half the engine room 2 days ago. Most of the weapon systems were offline, and those that remained functional were running on backup power that Chief Engineer Park Day had jury-rigged from emergency batteries. Dr. Yunbo moved through the ship like a ghost herself, treating crew members who had been poisoned by radiation leaks and injured in the constant battles. Her medical supplies had been exhausted a week ago, and she was now using salvaged alien medical equipment and improvised treatments that worked sometimes and failed others. The ship's crew had been reduced from 400 to fewer than 100 after months of fighting against impossible odds. Lieutenant Kim Sol worked at her weapons station, with bandages wrapped around her left arm and a concussion that made her vision blur when she turned her head too quickly. She had become the ship's tactical expert through necessity and could make damaged weapons perform miracles with precise targeting and creative ammunition management. Sergeant Major Ojin led 37 Marines who had learned to fight in damaged armor with weapons that might explode in their hands. His soldiers were experts at boarding enemy ships and stealing supplies that kept the indomitable spirit operational for a few more days. Tech specialist Bei Min monitored communications from her station where half the displays had been destroyed by enemy fire during their last engagement. She still intercepted Vorthak transmissions and tracked human survivor movements across the sector, with equipment held together by determination and spare wire. The intercepted message that changed everything arrived during the ship's night cycle when most of the crew was trying to sleep in damaged compartments. A massive human refugee convoy had become trapped in the Kepler sector. When their escort ships were destroyed by Vorthak raiders, 200,000 civilians were stranded aboard slow-moving transport vessels with no protection and no way to reach hyperspace. The main Vorthak battle fleet was moving directly toward their position and would reach them in 18 hours. Captain Lee Nari read the message 3 times before the full horror of the situation became clear. The refugee convoy had been traveling toward safety for 2 weeks and was now less than 6 hours from the hyperspace jump point that would carry them to freedom. But their engines had been damaged in the raider attack, and they could not reach escape velocity before the Vorthak fleet arrived. The civilian ships carried families from 12 different colony worlds, including thousands of children who had never known war. Nari called her senior staff to the damaged conference room where they gathered around a holographic display that showed the tactical situation. The refugee convoy appeared as blue dots clustered around the hyperspace jump point, while red enemy symbols approached from 3 directions. Chief Engineer Park Day explained that the indomitable spirit could not reach the convoy's position before the Vorthak fleet arrived. Even if they could get there, the ship's weapons were too damaged to fight off an entire battle group. Dr. Yunbo pointed out that most of the crew was suffering from radiation poisoning and exhaustion that made complex operations extremely dangerous. Sergeant Major Ojin noted that his Marines were ready to fight, but lacked the numbers to make a difference against such overwhelming enemy forces. Tech Specialist Bei Min had been monitoring Vorthak communications and confirmed that the alien fleet knew about the trapped convoy and was moving to capture rather than destroy it. The refugees would be taken alive for the biological experiments that had become the true purpose of the Vorthak invasion. Lieutenant Kim Sol studied the star charts and weapon ranges until she found something that made her eyes widen with possibility. The Kepler sector contained an unstable red giant star whose solar flares had been growing stronger for the past decade. If properly triggered, the star's magnetic field could create a cascade effect that would blind enemy sensors across half the system. The effect would last just long enough for the refugee convoy to complete their jump to hyperspace. Captain Nari listened as Kim Sol explained what she called the Wolf's Gambit, because it required them to get close enough to the star to trigger the cascade effect manually. The plan meant flying directly into solar radiation that would destroy their remaining systems and kill anyone not protected by the ship's failing life support. It also meant using their last operational weapons to create artificial magnetic pulses that would destabilize the star's corona. If the timing was perfect, the resulting solar storm would create enough electromagnetic interference to hide 200,000 refugees. If the timing was wrong, the star might go nova and destroy everything in the system, including the people they were trying to save. Chief Engineer Park Day ran calculations on his damaged computer systems and confirmed that the ship could survive in the star's radiation field for approximately 17 minutes. That would be enough time to trigger the cascade effect if everything worked perfectly. Dr. Yunbo warned that exposure to that level of radiation would cause fatal damage to anyone not in the ship's most heavily shielded areas. Most of the crew would have to retreat to the emergency shelters while a skeleton team operated the ship. From the bridge, Sergeant Major Ojin volunteered his Marines to handle damage control during the operation because they were trained to work in hostile environments. The plan required precise navigation to reach the optimal position near the star without being destroyed by solar radiation. It also required exact timing to coordinate the artificial magnetic pulse with the star's natural flare. Cycle Lieutenant Kim Sol would handle weapons targeting, while Chief Engineer Park Day managed power distribution from the engine room. Captain Nari would pilot the ship manually because the navigation systems were too damaged for computer control. The crew understood that the Wolf's Gambit was a suicide mission disguised as a rescue operation. Even if they successfully triggered the cascade effect, the indomitable spirit would be left powerless and defenseless in one of the most dangerous regions of space. The Vorthak fleet would eventually find them and finish what they had started months ago, but 200,000 civilians would be safe, and that was worth any price. Dr. Yunbo distributed radiation medicine to the bridge crew, while Sergeant Major Ojin prepared his Marines for emergency repairs under impossible conditions. Tech Specialist Bei Min established communication protocols with the refugee convoy so they would know when to begin their escape sequence. Chief Engineer Park Day worked miracles with failing systems and created power reserves that should not have been possible. The indomitable spirit changed course toward the red giant star and began the approach that would define the last chapter of their story. Behind them, the Vorthak fleet continued its advance toward the trapped refugees, unaware that death was coming from an unexpected direction. The ship's sensors detected increasing radiation levels as they moved closer to the star's photosphere. Captain Nari felt the bridge temperature rising despite the failing environmental systems. Her crew worked with the focused intensity of people who knew they were writing their names in history. The red giant filled their forward displays like an angry eye watching. Their approach solar flares danced across the star's surface in patterns that Lieutenant Kim Sol was learning to read like a tactical manual. The timing had to be perfect, because they would only get one chance to save the refugees. Captain Lee Nari activated the ship's communication system to record a final message for anyone who might someday find the indomitable spirit's wreckage. Her words were simple, because the situation required no explanation. They were human, and they did not abandon their own. The indomitable spirit floated dead in space like a broken tooth in the mouth of eternity, and Captain Lee Nari could hear the ship dying around her, with each labored breath of the failing life support systems. The Wolf's Gambit had worked perfectly, and 200,000 refugees had escaped to hyperspace, while the Vorthak fleet was blinded by the artificial solar storm, but the price had been everything the ship had left to give. The main engines were completely destroyed, and half the hull had been melted by radiation from the red giant star. Most of the crew was dead from radiation poisoning or explosive decompression, when the solar flares had overwhelmed their shielding. Chief Engineer Park Day worked alone in the engine room with a radiation suit that was more holes than protection, trying to restore basic power to weapon systems that should not have been able to function. He had been exposed to enough radiation to kill him 3 times over, but kept working because the alternative was watching his shipmates die without fighting. Dr. Yunbo moved through the ship's twisted corridors, treating the 47 surviving crew members with medical supplies that consisted of bandages and hope. Her hair had fallen out from radiation exposure and her hands shook when she worked, but she refused to stop until everyone who could be saved had been saved. Lieutenant Kim Sol sat at her weapon station blind in one eye and deaf in her left ear from a console explosion. During the solar storm, she was converting the ship's remaining missiles into makeshift mines and improvised weapons, because conventional naval tactics had stopped applying to their situation. The Vorthak fleet had found them 2 days ago, and was now approaching with the slow confidence of hunters who knew their prey was trapped. Enemy ships surrounded the asteroid field, where the indomitable spirit had taken refuge, and were methodically closing the trap. Sergeant Major O. Jin commanded 23 Marines who had turned the ship's damaged corridors into a fortress using salvaged armor plating and alien weapons. His soldiers were dying slowly from radiation sickness, but had refused evacuation to the ship's shielded areas because someone had to defend the outer sections. Tech specialist Bei Min monitored enemy communications from a station that sparked and smoked, but still functioned well enough to intercept Vorthak battle coordination. The aliens were arguing among themselves about whether to capture the ghost ship intact or destroy it completely. Their respect for human stubbornness had grown into something approaching fear after months of hunting a ship that refused to die. Commander Henri had been a fighter pilot before, joining the indomitable spirit's crew, and now coordinated the ship's remaining defensive systems from a backup bridge. She had lost both legs when a Vorthak boarding torpedo breached the main bridge, but continued working from a makeshift command. Chair Petty Officer Nam Su was 19 years old and had volunteered for every dangerous repair mission because he was small enough to crawl through damaged ventilation shafts. His youth made him recover faster from radiation exposure, and he used that advantage to keep critical systems operational for a few more hours. Chief Gunner Kobin had 30 years of experience with human naval weapons and had spent the last week creating new types of ammunition from salvaged materials. He could turn a damaged missile warhead into a proximity mine or convert a broken energy cannon into a short-range plasma thrower. The ship had become a hybrid of human engineering and Vorthak technology, held together by desperation and the refusal to accept defeat. Every system had been modified or replaced with alien components that the crew learned to operate through trial and error. The life support recyclers used Vorthak atmospheric processors, while the weapons drew power from captured enemy generators. Even the artificial intelligence had been upgraded with alien computing cores that gave it new capabilities for damage assessment and tactical analysis. Captain Lee Nari spent her time moving through the ship and talking to each surviving crew member, because leadership meant being present when everything was falling apart. She checked on the Marines who were building barricades in the ship's corridors and would soon face enemy boarders in hand-to-hand combat. She visited the engine room where Park Day was performing miracles with equipment that existed more in theory than reality. She stopped by the medical bay where Dr. Yoon Bo was treating patients who should have been dead, but kept fighting anyway. Each conversation was brief because there was work to do and time was running short. But the crew needed to see that their captain had not given up. The Vorthak ultimatum arrived on the third day, delivered by a probe that approached under a white flag of truce. The message was translated by Bay Min and broadcast throughout the ship so everyone could hear what the enemy was offering. Surrender immediately and die quickly by spacing, or continue fighting and be taken alive for biological experimentation. The alien commander who sent the message expressed admiration for human courage but explained that resistance was futile against such overwhelming force. Captain Lee Nari listened to the ultimatum twice before responding with a message that became legendary throughout human space. Her words were simple and direct because the situation required no elaborate explanations. The crew of the Indomitable Spirit was human, and humans did not surrender. They would continue fighting until the last breath left their bodies. The enemy could come and take them if they thought they were strong enough. The Vorthak response was immediate and overwhelming, as 300 warships began their final approach toward the asteroid field. Enemy commanders had decided that capturing the ghost ship alive was less important than ending the threat it represented. The battle that followed defied every principle of naval warfare because it was fought by people who had already accepted death. The Indomitable Spirit used the asteroids around them as weapons and shields while pouring every remaining shot into the approaching enemy. Fleet Lieutenant Kim Sol targeted enemy command ships with improvised missiles that carried nuclear warheads salvaged from damaged torpedoes. Her accuracy was perfect because she had learned to read Vorthak tactical patterns over months of desperate combat. Chief Gunner Ko Bin turned the ship's hull into a weapon by mounting captured alien cannons on improvised turrets that could fire in any direction. His jury-rigged systems delivered devastating firepower at point-blank range. When enemy ships tried to board, Sergeant Major Oh Jin led his Marines through the ship's corridors where they fought Vorthak boarding parties with weapons taken from previous battles. The aliens discovered that conquering a human ship was very different from destroying it, because humans fought harder when cornered. Commander Henri coordinated defensive fire from her damaged command station while Petty Officer Nam Su crawled through ventilation shafts to repair systems under enemy fire. Dr. Yoon Bo treated wounded crew members in a medical bay that was simultaneously being used as a weapons depot and communications center. The battle raged for 18 hours as the Indomitable Spirit proved that even a dying ship could inflict terrible damage on enemies who underestimated human determination. Vorthak casualties mounted as their boarding parties encountered resistance that grew fiercer as the defending crew grew smaller. Captain Lee Nari fought alongside her crew in the ship's corridors and proved that command meant leading from the front when everything was at stake. The aliens had expected to find broken humans begging for mercy, but instead found warriors who sang old Earth battle songs while they died. Chief Engineer Park Day kept the weapons firing until the engine room was flooded with radiation, and his radiation suit finally failed. His last act was to overload the ship's remaining power cells in a way that would give his shipmates one final devastating salvo. The end was approaching, but the crew of the Indomitable Spirit had already written their names in fire across the darkness between stars. 12 people remained alive on the bridge of the Indomitable Spirit, and Captain Lee Nari could see death reflected in their eyes like candlelight flickering in the wind. The ship around them was more wreckage than vessel, with hull breaches in every section and life support systems that wheezed like a dying animal. Chief Engineer Park Day was dead in the engine room where he had fought until his radiation suit failed. But his final gift kept the bridge weapons operational for a few more minutes. Dr. Yoon Bo sat at a damaged console treating Lieutenant Kim Sol's radiation burns with bare hands because her medical equipment had been destroyed in the last enemy bombardment. The young weapons officer could barely see through her swollen eyes but continued calculating firing solutions for guns that existed more in hope than reality. Sergeant Major Oh Jin leaned against a bulkhead with 3 Vorthak energy wounds in his chest, while he manually loaded the last ammunition into a cannon that should have been operated by 5 people. Commander Henri coordinated what remained of their defenses from her makeshift command chair while Petty Officer Nam Su crawled through smoking ventilation shafts to maintain power connections tech. Specialist Bei Min monitored enemy communications through damaged equipment and reported that the Vorthak were preparing their final assault. Chief Gunner Ko Bin had lost his left arm to enemy fire, but continued operating weapon systems with mechanical precision learned through decades of naval service. The 8 other survivors moved through their duties with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had long since stopped counting their wounds. Outside the bridge, Vorthak boarding parties controlled most of the ship and were advancing through corridors filled with the bodies of Marines who had died fighting. The enemy had lost over 200 soldiers taking the outer sections, and their commanders were furious that a handful of humans had cost them so dearly. Captain Lee Nari shared the last of their emergency rations with her crew, in what had become their final meal together. The recycled water tasted better than wine because it was shared with heroes, and the dried protein bars seemed like a feast because they were eating with friends. She looked at each face around her and saw people who had volunteered to die so that strangers might live. Dr. Yun Bo had saved countless lives with improvised medicine and determination that refused to accept the impossible. Lieutenant Kim Sol had become a tactical genius who could make broken weapons perform miracles through pure skill and courage. Sergeant Major Oh Jin had led his Marines with the kind of leadership that inspired ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Commander Henri had kept their defenses operational, despite injuries that should have killed her hours ago. Chief Gunner Ko Bin had turned salvaged junk into weapons that struck fear into the hearts of their enemies' tech. Specialist Bei Min had maintained communications with the outside galaxy and ensured that someone would remember their sacrifice. Petty Officer Nam Su had crawled through hell to keep their systems running when everyone else would have given up. The others had names and stories and families they would never see again, but they had chosen to stay and fight when they could have run. Captain Lee Nari activated the ship's final log entry, knowing that someone might eventually find their wreckage and wonder who they had been. Her words were simple because the truth needed no decoration. They were the crew of the indomitable spirit, and they had done their duty. They had protected 2,800,000 civilians during 3 months of fighting against impossible odds. They had proved that humans would rather die than surrender their own people to alien predators. They had made the enemy pay a price that would be remembered long after their names were forgotten. The Vorthak assault on the bridge began with cutting torches that sliced through the armored doors like knives through paper. Enemy soldiers poured through the breaches expecting to find cowering humans begging for their lives. Instead, they found Captain Lee Nari standing at attention beside her command chair with her surviving crew arranged in formation behind her. Her uniform was torn and stained with blood, but she wore it with the dignity of someone who had never compromised her principles. Lieutenant Kim Sol fired the ship's last operational weapon into the enemy ranks while Sergeant Major Oh Jin threw himself at alien soldiers with nothing but a combat knife. Gar Yun Bo tended to wounded crew members while enemy fire filled the air around her because healing was her duty until her final breath. Commander Henri activated every remaining ship system in a cascade of explosions that took out the first wave of boarding troops. Chief Gunner Ko Bin manually detonated ammunition stores throughout the ship, while Petty Officer Nam Su triggered emergency bulkhead seals that trapped enemy forces. Tech Specialist Bei Min transmitted their final battle report to any human forces that might be listening. In the vastness of space, the Vorthak had expected to capture prisoners for their biological experiments but found only warriors who would not kneel. Captain Lee Nari drew her sidearm and fired at the enemy commander who led the assault while alien weapons cut down her remaining crew. She watched Lieutenant Kim Sol die at her weapon station and saw Sergeant Major Oh Jin fall while charging an enemy position. Dr. Yun Bo was killed while trying to reach a wounded sailor, and Commander Henri died defending the ship's communication systems. Each death was a small light going out, but together they created a fire that would burn in human memory forever. The bridge filled with smoke and the screams of dying aliens who had learned too late that humans fought hardest when everything was lost. Captain Lee Nari felt enemy fire tear through her body, but remained standing because a ship's captain died at her post. Her final act was to activate the ship's self-destruct sequence that Chief Engineer Park Day had prepared before his death. The indomitable spirit's reactor went critical in a chain reaction that consumed the ship and 50 surrounding Vorthak vessels. The explosion lit up the asteroid field like a new star being born, and could be seen from neighboring star systems. The blast erased all evidence that humans had ever been there except for the wreckage of alien ships and the legend that would outlive them all. In the years that followed, human fleets would find Vorthak survivors who spoke in whispers about the ghost ship that refused to die. They would learn that the crew of the Indomitable Spirit had delayed the enemy advance long enough to save millions of lives. The refugees they protected would name their children after the heroes who died in the dark between stars. Captain Nari and her crew became symbols of human determination that inspired resistance movements across the galaxy. Their story was told in every human language and sang in every human colony, as a reminder that some things were worth dying for. Vorthak Empire learned that there were species in the universe that could not be conquered, because they would choose death before surrender. They discovered that humans possessed something more dangerous than weapons or technology. Humans had the ability to transform defeat into victory through the simple act of refusing to accept the impossible. The final log entry from the Indomitable Spirit was recovered years later from a damaged data core that survived the ship's destruction. Captain Nari's last words became humanity's battle cry in the war that followed. We knew we would never return home, but home lives on because we chose to stand here in the darkness and say no further. Let this be remembered, that humans do not yield, not today, not ever, until the last gasp. The war continued for decades, but the Vorthak never again underestimated human resolve. They had learned that some victories cost more than defeat, and some enemies become more dangerous when cornered. The crew of the Indomitable Spirit had taught the galaxy that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to fight despite being afraid. Their names were carved on monuments throughout human space, and their story was required study at every military academy. Children who had been saved by their sacrifice grew up to become the leaders who finally drove the Vorthak back to their home systems. The ghost ship had become more than a legend because legends could inspire people to do impossible things. The end, the 12 people who died on that bridge had won a victory that no amount of enemy firepower could defeat. They had proved that the human spirit was unbreakable, and that some flames burned brighter in the darkness.